Look, there are four issues in this war. One is NATO, which is a very serious issue. The question is, will the U.S. Put military bases and missile systems right on Russia's border? This has been a fundamental issue for more than 30 years. To this day, it remains U.S. policy that the answer is yes, we're determined to do so. As long as that goes on, this war will continue. Or Ukraine will get utterly destroyed, or we'll go to nuclear war. One of those possibilities. So that's issue number one. Issue number two is the nuclear arms framework. The United States destroyed the nuclear arms framework by walking out of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, walking out of the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, torpedoing JCPOA, the agreement with Iran, which Trump torpedoed in 2017, 2018. Trump also is the one that walked out of the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty. So there is no effective framework right now for nuclear arms control. This is the second major issue. This is of fundamental significance for every living thing on this planet, for every person on this planet. We need to get back even to the conditions of the Cold War. We're in much worse shape now, which is why the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists says in its doomsday clock, we're 90 seconds to midnight, the closest to midnight we've ever been, and much closer than during the height of the Cold War. Thank you, because we don't even have a nuclear arms framework. The third issue on the table is Crimea. That goes back actually to 1853. It was the plan of Lord Palmerston and of the French to banish Russia from its warm water port, its naval base in Sevastopol. This is a continuation of that effort. It was in Brzezinski's imagination. It is all a continuation of the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856. When the U.S. and the right wing in Ukraine overthrew Yanukovych, the first thing Russia did was take back Crimea because it said, we're not letting this fall into NATO hands. No way. This is our naval base since 1783. And then the fourth issue is the issue of the four regions, Lugansk and Donetsk, Kherson and Zaporizhia. Russia now claims them. Ironically, and I don't think most people understand this, Russia was making no territorial claims until the fall of 2022. Not during the 2010s. What Russia was saying after the 2014 coup was that the attacks by essentially Western Ukraine, Ukrainian nationalists on the ethnic Russians in Eastern Ukraine, which did not accept this coup, needed to stop. And a treaty was negotiated called the Minsk II agreement, which was backed by the UN Security Council and supposedly guaranteed by France and Germany. The United States agreed with Ukraine, ignore the Minsk II agreement. Ignore it. It called for protection of the Russian language, Russian culture in these Russian regions, and for political autonomy for the ethnic Russian regions following the 2014 coup. It was signed, it was agreed, it was backed by the UN Security Council, it was backed by France and Germany in the so-called Normandy process, and the United States cynically, completely cynically, blew it off, telling Ukraine, you don't have to do that. That was true under Obama and under Trump, and it continued to be true under Biden. That's the uniparty once again. So these are the issues that need resolution. They're all on the table. This has very little to do with Ukraine and Russia. This is about the United States and Russia. And we need to get back to an arms control framework. We need to get back to we need to agree on no NATO enlargement, which was the provocation of the whole crisis. We have to accept, which everybody does that anywhere in reality land, that Crimea is not going back because Russia is never going to let that fall into NATO hands or enemy hands. And that has been true for 175 years, thank you. And on the territories where Russia wasn't making claims after hundreds of thousands of deaths and this fight, there's going to be territorial concessions. I don't know what they're going to be because they will depend on the overall framework of negotiations. The idea that there will just be, say, a ceasefire or an armistice line and that Ukraine will then join NATO, which is what some Democrats brew it, they raise it in discussion, is absurd. Russia is not going to stop fighting as long as NATO enlargement is on the table. This is the basic casus belli. This is the basic reason why we are at war. So we have a number of things to truly negotiate. Russia's security interests are absolutely real. And had we understood that rather than the neocon position that we don't have to listen to anybody, if we had just done that, we would have avoided this disaster altogether. And by the way, it's formal NATO policy, Article 10, which says that if the United States and Ukraine decide that the U.S. will have NATO military bases on Russia's border, it's, quote, none of Russia's business. Well, this is absurd. This is in violation of every norm, standard about threats to the international peace under the UN Charter, under OSCE. It's the opposite of our Monroe Doctrine, which told the rest of the world, you stay completely out of our hemisphere.
And it was pretty contrary to the U.S. position when the sovereign Cuban government invited Soviet nuclear submarines and Soviet nuclear missiles to be stationed in Cuba in 1962 in order to deter the United States from trying again to invade Cuba. Nobody said, oh, the Cuban government, whatever they want on their soil, that's their business. We felt we had a lot of interest and a lot of say in what the Cubans were able to have in their country because it was just 90 miles away. In the case of Ukraine, of course, it's right on the border. Let me ask you, though, the Ukrainians, everyone but Zelensky, have been trying to sound the alarm for a while now. Like, we know we're losing this war. We know we can't win this war. We don't have the people. It's destroying our country. Kind of leaking that, other than that, Zelensky is kind of a maniac at this point. He's kind of gotten unhinged and detached from reality, where he still thinks victory is coming. But everyone else in the top levels of the Ukrainian political circle and military understand that that's not going to happen. The change has been over the last month or so, where a lot of, I think, surprising voices have started to publicly and very bluntly say that we have to accept the reality that Ukraine is not going to win this war, starting with the Czech president, Peter Pavel, who has been a very vocal defender of Ukraine for obvious reasons. But even people like Richard Haass, the longtime president of the Council on Foreign Relations, went on Morning Joe, and he basically gave this speech saying, we have to start accepting reality, that we're going to have to give up things to the Russians in order to end this war that we can't keep going on. The question, though, for me has always been, if you look what NATO said from the start, the way they define victory in this very maximalist way, which is victory means nothing more or less than expelling every single Russian troop from Ukrainian soil, including Crimea, it made it almost impossible for anything to happen.
And Glenn, not only doing that, and Ukraine joining NATO.
Exactly. So it was such an unrealistic goal that it was almost bound to lead to either endless war in order to avoid Western humiliation, or, as you say, some kind of nuclear exchange where both sides are getting desperate. Do you, though, think these public statements, these increasing public statements from unexpected sources, that we have to start accepting reality signals a softening of the American and NATO determination to continue to just fund this war forever?
Yes, for sure. The only sad point I would say, and I only is in quotation marks, because it's so unbelievable. Every bit of this was completely predictable for years. And when these events started in 2022, I'm not even talking about 2014, but when the current escalation started in 2022, it was obvious Ukraine could not win, that either Ukraine would lose or we would go to nuclear war, one of the two. This was completely obvious. Now, it was so obvious that it's actually now the conclusion that many people are reaching. The sad part is there are probably 600,000 Ukrainians dead from that obvious point in February 2022 till now. They don't count the dead in Washington. They don't seem to even care. They didn't think about it. I wrote up a call for a negotiated settlement in the spring of 2022 where I wouldn't change a word from all of the arguments because they all were obvious then and they turned out to be completely true. And what the statement at the time said is, if we continue, there will be tragic, massive loss of life. But that seems not to figure in to the calculus of these people that are calling these shots. How can one understand this? Well, one is it is a system in which mass death is just something doesn't involve you as a senior U.S. strategist. It's not your dead anyway. It's, you're tough, you're trained, you're not supposed to think about those things and so on. So there's part of that. Part of it is, oh God, they were so stupid. They thought they could bluff their way to success. Maybe Putin won't do this. Maybe when we cut Russia out of the SWIFT banking system, the Russian economy is going to collapse. Maybe our HIMARS and our ATACMS are going to beat them. Maybe Russia won't mobilize. They were playing poker with a lousy hand. But, they got into the game. They started to raise. Of course, they're raising Ukraine's chips, not their own. And they just kept thinking something's going to show up. Maybe he'll be taken out. Maybe there'll be regime change in Russia. Maybe he'll back down. Who knows? But it's such a reckless, stupid gamble. And it was obvious then. I begged the White House, avoid this, because it was clear. This wasn't subtle. This wasn't a hard call, is what I'm saying. This was obvious all the way along. And yet they decided that they would gamble with Ukraine this way. And until today, because they're so damn shameless, so irresponsible, so concerned with their own name and their own legacy, which is bloodshed, by the way, rather than reality, that until this day, they're propounding a completely phony line. I just read the Financial Times lunch with Jens Stoltenberg, a first-class failure, somebody I knew when he was finance minister and prime minister of Norway, and I was a friend. But what a disaster this person has been. But he said in the interview, we called Putin's bluff. Are you kidding? Putin called your bluff, Stoltenberg. Exactly the opposite. They've just got it so wrong because they're in a world of political spin. They're playing games with other people's lives, hundreds of thousands of lives.
And they're basically explicit about that. They're basically explicit about that. The argument finally became, oh, look, this is a good deal for us, the Americans, because it's only those Ukrainians who are dying and not any Americans. And of course, those who pointed out what you're saying from the beginning, and there were a lot of people who recognized that and said it, pretty much all of them who said Ukraine can't win, the Russians are, perceiving an existential threat, they're going to go to every length to win, were put on official lists of being Kremlin propagandists and the like, because you were put on some of those, and so was I. I want to return, though, to the historical framework you laid out at the start, where you traced this kind of continuous foreign policy between both parties starting in 1991 because of the fall of the Soviet Union and the idea that the U.S. is now the world's sole superpower. We can do whatever we want. And I think that was more or less true for some period of time. Do you think that's still true? Are we still in a unipolar world where the U.S. is the sole superpower and can do whatever we want? Or how has that changed?
We were never the sole superpower that could do whatever we want. We couldn't even, quote, win in Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria or Libya. We could make a colossal mess. We could kill a lot of people. We could overthrow governments, but we couldn't quite win. So we were never the sole superpower of the world. But now it's not even a close call, because China's a superpower, India's a superpower, Russia's a superpower, the United States is a superpower. We all face the existential reality that a misstep by any of these countries could end up blowing up the whole world. The idea of unipolarity or U.S. leadership or U.S. as the indispensable country, come on. It's so completely fantastical and delusional. We have to learn to get along. We're 4.1% of the world population. We are a smaller economy measured in purchasing power prices than China. We're perhaps half of China's industrial capacity. And anyway, these numbers aren't very meaningful when any of these countries can blow up everybody. So, of course, we are not the sole superpower. We're not the leader of the world. These are delusions. Now, when an old man like Biden says them, you can kind of understand. He's living in the past. He is a delusional person at this point. This is the rhetoric of the 1990s, which was completely overblown at that point. It had an air of credibility to it, because what was China? Rice growing villages. What was Russia? A collapsed, failed society. So, you could think it was naive even at that time if you knew some economics and some history and could look ahead a bit. But in any event, today it's completely bizarre even to brew at these ideas. You look at every number, whether it's military, technological, economic, population. We better learn to get along with other countries and stop pretending that we run the world. We don't even, most of the time, the world votes overwhelmingly against the United States at the General Assembly because we're so out of line with global realities right now. We don't know how to calculate it all. We thought, we're going to put on sanctions on Russia and the whole world trade with Russia is going to stop. Are you kidding? What stopped was some of the trade of the U.S. and NATO countries and our military allies in East Asia, Japan, Korea, Australia, and so on. But for the rest of the world, which is the vast majority of the human population and most of the world economy, trade went on. So we don't understand these facts. We seem not to be able to understand the dynamics of our geopolitics right now, maybe because we have been blinded to this ideology, which was wrong at the start and is absolutely delusional today. I have to add, Glenn, when you really look at it, this goes back. It goes back to World War II. It really does go back to the 1840s and the British hatred of Russia, because Russia, they thought, posed a threat to the British Empire and to British hegemony. That was the roots of the Crimean War. It's amazing that at the end of World War II, which I'm looking at very intensively right now to try to understand some of these dynamics, even before the dust had settled, when the Soviet Union had borne the brunt of the battle against Hitler's Germany, the United States was, Britain, Churchill already was trying to launch Operation Unthinkable to start a war with the Russians, with the Soviet Union. The United States started to recruit the Nazis and started to spread CIA operations across Eastern Europe without a loss of a moment, because we decided that Soviet Union was our implacable, unavoidable foe, which had just been our ally during World War II. And we've been on this business ideologically that we can't live together. What shocked me, because I lived through it personally, was in 1990, 91, 92, when Gorbachev and Yeltsin were pleading for just peace and normal relations and a little bit of financial help to stabilize a financial crisis. The U.S. could not take peaceful cooperation for an answer. It could only take victory for an answer. And that is why we're in the mess that we're in today.
Yeah, just along those lines, I mean, for however unhinged and militaristic and indifferent to human life the United States foreign policy establishment is under both parties, the British are always, for me, a step or two worse, and especially when it comes to Russia, the obsessive contempt. And of course, it was Boris Johnson who played such a big role in quashing any attempt to diplomatically resolve that war. Is almost psychopathic. Is really in the blood and bones of the British.
And here Keith Starmer comes in as the new Labour prime minister in a country in deep internal economic crisis. The National Health Service is in a state of utter disrepair. There's massive social unrest and ethnic fights and internal violence, and an economy that's completely stalled out. And what does he do? The first thing is go to Kiev, focus on the Ukraine war. And if what we're hearing is true, and I have every reason to believe it's true, in this recent debate, should Ukraine be allowed to use Storm Shadow missiles and other NATO missile systems to strike deep into Russia? Who's the greatest cheerleader?
Yeah, the British. The British. It's amazing. I know. It's
unbelievable. And the United States can stop, because the British can't do anything without the United States technology, hardware, tracking systems, navigation systems, satellite systems, all the rest. So the U.S., but it's the British who are the most warmongering of all. It's so deep, this imperial mentality. Absolutely. And this arrogance, even after all of what's happened to Britain.
I almost think that because they are so weakened in comparison to their glorious imperial past, being that extreme is almost a psychological compensation. Like, we might be much smaller now and much weaker and much less relevant, but we are still that courageous Churchillian force that is ready to go fight for what is good. And that's how they all convince themselves. Just in the little bit of time we have left, this has all been pretty dark and depressing, and we didn't even get to what might be the most dangerous developments of all, which is the one in the Middle East. I spent most of my time talking to Professor Mearsheimer about that last night, so I'm glad we had this other ground that we focused on instead, so it wasn't redundant. But obviously, I do want to get your view on what has now become a regional war. I mean, there's still a question of how much it's going to escalate, how much out of control it'll be, but we're not anymore in the risk of a regional war. The Israelis are fighting on multiple fronts in multiple different countries. You have the Iranian ballistic missile attack, those sorts of things. What do you think is the Israeli mindset in terms of what it is that they're doing? Do they actually have some strategic goal in mind, or are they just drunk on this sort of long-standing thirst to kill all the people and all the countries that they perceive to be their enemies?
Just as the Ukraine war would end the moment the U.S. president picks up the phone and calls the Russian president and says, you know, that NATO enlargement idea, enlarging to Ukraine and Georgia, that's a terrible idea. We'll make clear publicly it's over. That will end the fighting in Ukraine. Yeah, there are other details, but that will end the fighting. In the case of the Middle East, the moment that there is a state of Palestine, admitted as the 194th UN member state on the legal borders of 4 June 1967, the fighting will stop. So why doesn't it stop? Well, it doesn't stop because not only the current government, but because of years of propaganda as well in Israel, the Israeli public rejects a state of Palestine. Without a state of Palestine, there can be no peace because at best, and I put that in quotation marks, it is a brutal apartheid regime. And at worst, it's a regime of ethnic cleansing and genocidal behavior by Israel to try to hold on to territories that are not theirs, where the occupation is illegal, as recently judged by the International Court of Justice this past July, as recently voted by the UN General Assembly, supporting the ICJ ruling. And until there is a state of Palestine, there will be no peace. Now, Netanyahu's entire political career, Likud's entire purpose as a political party and political force in Israel was to reject a state of Palestine. And now it's much worse because a significant part of this government represents the illegal settlers and the zealots, the religious nationalists who are ideological zealots who look at the book of Joshua from the 6th century BC and say, well, God promised us all the land from the Euphrates to the Mediterranean, and that's how it's going to be. And so we have a complete mess because Israel rejects the one thing that would end the war and actually bring peace and security for Israel. Now, why do they continue to do this in the face of global intransigence and spreading disaster? The reason is that they think they have the United States completely on their side. And when Netanyahu, in vulgar terms, boasted at the podium of the UN General Assembly last week that the long arm of Israel reaches right across the Middle East, he said.
The long arm of Israeli might.
Yeah, he was talking about the U.S. Air Force. He was talking about the U.S. military. Now, we know that it's true that the Israel lobby has dominated U.S. politics for decades. But I believe this is changing quickly right now because the American people do not buy into Israeli extremism. The American people do not want to escalate to a regional or world war for the sake of what's called Greater Israel. That means Israel's continued apartheid rule over the Palestinian people and its continued illegal occupation of Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the parts of the Golan. They don't want that. And the entire world community, other than the United States and Israel, and a few tiny islands where the United States has the hand across their neck.
They were part of the coalition of the willing, too. They supported the Iraq War, Micronesia and the Marshall Islands.
There you go. So you can get a few votes, but basically the world is saying, stop this war. We want two states as international law has held it now for many decades, and we want it now. And the American people want that as well. So I think the Israeli lobby, which has been, or the Israel lobby, which has been so powerful, and it remains powerful up until Election Day, is going to have quite a shock because this cannot remain American policy, and I think it will not remain American policy. I actually believe, if we don't blow ourselves up beforehand, I actually believe we're going to have a state of Palestine soon, and it's going to be imposed on Israel by the United Nations Security Council, and the United States is going to turn to become the right side of this rather than the single major holdout in the entire international system.
But just about that, because that's an optimistic picture, and I think it's good to end on a note of optimism, and I want to make this my last question, just out of respect for your time as well. And I should note that, of course, while a two-state solution, a Palestinian state, would eliminate the root cause of the conflict in that region, the position of Hezbollah and Nasrallah before they killed him was, we're willing to have a ceasefire right now, as long as there's a ceasefire for Gaza as well. That's the position of Iran as well. And Israel won't even cease bombing Gaza in order to facilitate a broader peace in the region, even if it's not an ultimate solution. And so my question is, let's assume that what you're saying is...
In fact, Glenn,
Glenn,
I think it's right to say that if a Hamas leader says we want peace, or a Hezbollah leader says we want peace, they become the target of an Israeli assassination right away.
Which is what happened with Nasrallah.
Yes. This is the opposite of what you might think, but it is because Israel is dead set against a two-state solution.
That's why I want to ask you, because it's so interesting, the propaganda that we hear. We're always told that all these countries that are Muslim, or even the Russians, don't understand any language other than force, whereas that's what Putin recently said is true of the U.S. But we've also been told for so long that what makes Iran so dangerous is that they're run by religious extremists. They have an apocalyptic cult. They don't care about human life or the value of it. They crave death, and therefore they don't have any restraint or operate rationally in any way. And all we've seen from Iran over the last several years, including the last year, including in this last ballistic missile attack, was enormous restraint. All those ballistic missiles were aimed at entirely military targets. No civilian targets were hit. No Israelis were killed, whereas the Israelis have the exact opposite posture to civilian life. The question then becomes, for all what you're saying about how the Israelis are going to have imposed on them a two-state solution, even though they don't want one, and there's finally going to be some limits on them, on some level, it seems like Israel is much closer to an apocalyptic cult, this kind of religious fanaticism, this militaristic fanaticism. And of course, they too have nuclear weapons, which, as you pointed out, means they have the ability to destroy the world. Is that your view of the current Israeli state, that they basically, even if the entire world did demand that they have a Palestinian state, that the Israelis are so far gone that almost nothing could limit what they do?
I'm a bit more optimistic than that. Not about particular characters like Smotrich, a self-professed fascist, Ben Gvir, a few other characters in high position, not some of these fanatical religious nationalists, but Israeli society overwhelmingly would prefer survival and security to the end of the world, to an apocalypse. I don't believe that Israel's political system is in any way able to negotiate that, but I think it's able to absorb it. When it tried to negotiate it, the closest it came was Yitzhak Rabin as prime minister being assassinated by the far right. That's what changes history. We've had the same in the United States. When a president really tried fundamentally to change the Cold War, John F. Kennedy, he was killed by very dark forces. And the same happened in Israel when negotiations under the Oslo process were taking place. Ehud Barak, who probably wanted a deal, was a coward. Maybe because he didn't want to be assassinated the way that Rabin had been just before him. But he failed to carry through clear, unambiguous commitments that Israel had under the Oslo process. Of course, our spin factory blamed everything
on Arafat.
On Arafat. But aside from the spin, the reality was that Israel couldn't bring itself to do this. I believe that it is the international community that needs to say to Israel and to the Palestinians and the rejectionists, there are many on the other side also, we're going to have two states. They're going to be separated by peacekeepers. They're going to live in security. Whether they ever talk to each other in the next generation, that's not going to be decided right away. But they're going to be two states. And the world is not going to let itself go into a regional or global war for the sake of Israel's religious fanaticism or its failure to listen to years and years and years, including in the most recent days, of the Arab countries saying, we want peace, we want security for Israel, based on the two-state solution. I also listened to the president of Iran face-to-face at the United Nations, and he spoke peace all week. No one was picking it up, not our mainstream media, and Netanyahu was speaking bloody war, but the president of Iran was speaking peace. And if we listen, if you actually look at what is being said, if you look at what the Jordanian foreign minister said just after Netanyahu spoke at the UN, the Jordanian foreign minister came out and said, on behalf of the 57 countries of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, I want to make clear we are for peace, mutual security of Israel and Palestine based on the two-state solution. Voila. This is how it's going to have to be. Will Israel accept this? Israeli society will. Will Smotrich or the leaders of the illegal settlers in the occupied territories accept it? Probably not at the beginning, but with enough effort and patience, they will as well.